Can you imagine a war that lasted 12 years, all because of a wooden bucket? This is the most absurd conflict in European history. In 1325, in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, two rival city-states, Modena and Bologna, began a war that would be remembered for centuries. However, what surprised posterity was not the intensity of the conflict or the number of casualties, but its cause, the theft of a wooden bucket. Modena and Bologna had been rivals for years. The cities competed for political, economic, and territorial supremacy, much like many other Italian city-states. These tensions were exacerbated by the political divisions between the Guelphs and Ghibellines, two factions that divided Italy. Modena supported the Ghibellines, who backed the Holy Roman Empire. On the other hand, Bologna was a Guelph city, loyal to the papacy. This ideological difference fueled the animosity between the two cities, which had already experienced previous confrontations. In this context, minor incidents between the two were not unusual, but one of these seemingly insignificant acts triggered a war that no one expected. It all began when a group of Modenese soldiers raided Bologna and, among other things, stole a wooden bucket from a public well. This bucket had no significant economic value, but for Bologna, it represented an outrage, a direct attack on its honor and prestige. The bucket became a symbol of the rivalry between the two cities. The theft of the bucket was seen by the Bolognese as an intolerable provocation. They immediately demanded the return of the bucket, but the Modenese, far from apologizing, proudly displayed it as a trophy, flaunting their success and humiliating their rival. This gesture not only enraged Bologna, but also turned what could have been a minor dispute into a diplomatic crisis. Bologna, outraged and eager to restore its honor, decided not to tolerate any more insults. The city mobilized its army and declared war on Modena, demanding the return of the bucket as a minimum condition to avoid a larger conflict. But Modena refused to yield, and what had started as a dispute over a small object escalated into a full-blown war. On November 15, 1325, tensions finally erupted at the Battle of Zappolino, which took place in the hills near Bologna. It was one of the largest and most decisive battles of the medieval era in Italy, with over 30,000 soldiers on the battlefield. Bologna's army, outnumbering Modena's, was confident of an easy victory. However, Bologna's expectations were not met. Despite being outnumbered, the Modenese, under the command of Passerino Bonacolsi, used effective tactics and managed to surround and defeat Bologna's army. The battle was a humiliation for Bologna, which not only lost many of its men, but also saw its forces retreat in disarray. After the victory, Modena's soldiers took advantage of the chaos and advanced to the very gates of Bologna. In a mocking gesture toward their rivals, they destroyed one of the city's main gates, reaffirming their triumph. But the most symbolic act was that the stolen bucket remained in Modene's hands, with no intention of being returned. The Battle of Zappolino was a turning point in the war. Although Bologna had more resources and a larger army, its defeat at Zappolino marked the beginning of the decline of its ambitions in the conflict. However, despite this decisive victory, the war did not end there. Over the following years, the two cities continued to fight in skirmishes and smaller battles. The conflict not only affected the armies and elites of Modena and Bologna, but also the civilian population. Trade routes between the two cities were blocked, severely damaging the region's economy. Farmers caught in the crossfire saw their lands looted and their crops destroyed, leading to a food crisis in some areas. Additionally, small villages near the front lines suffered direct consequences from the war. Many were displaced from their homes, and those who stayed behind had to contend with the constant threat of raids and looting by soldiers from both sides. What had begun as a dispute between two cities ended up affecting the entire region. Although Modena had achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Zappolino, Bologna did not immediately surrender. Over the next few years, the city tried several times to reorganize its army and reclaim the bucket, but each attempt ended in failure. Bologna simply could not recover from the devastating initial defeat, and gradually, its influence in the region began to wane. In 1337, after more than a decade of hostilities, both cities finally decided to end the conflict. There was no formal peace treaty, nor were there significant concessions from either side. Instead, the war gradually faded away, as both cities realized that continuing to fight would bring them no further benefit. Despite the end of the war, the rivalry between Modena and Bologna persisted for many years. Although they never again faced off in such an absurd manner as in the War of the Bucket, tensions between the two cities continued to influence local politics for centuries. However, the stolen bucket was never returned to Bologna. The bucket, the object that had sparked this entire conflict, remained in Modena as a symbol of its victory. For the Modenese, the bucket represented much more than a simple military triumph. It was a reminder of how they had outmatched a wealthier and more powerful city like Bologna. Today, that same bucket is still on display in the Ghirlandina Tower, the bell tower of Modena's cathedral. Over the centuries, the War of the Bucket became a local legend, told as an example of the absurdity of wars driven by pride and petty provocations. For historians, this conflict is an example of how small incidents can escalate into large conflicts if not handled properly from the outset. What is most surprising about this episode is that, despite its ridiculous cause, the war had a real impact on the lives of the people in the region. Trade routes were interrupted, the local economy suffered a severe blow, and thousands of people lost their lives or were displaced. The War of the Bucket, though absurd in its origin, was devastating in its consequences. The War of the Bucket reminds us that even the most trivial conflicts can have serious consequences. This historical episode shows us how pride and rivalries can lead to devastating wars if not managed with diplomacy. Sometimes, what begins as a small incident can have a much greater impact than anyone could have imagined.